Thank you, Professor Etheridge, for that introduction. Let me say how thrilled I am to be back at the U of A. I came here many moons ago to do an actual proficiency workshop in my other capacity, and among the participants there was somebody who was here this morning, my dear colleague, Professor Adel Suleiman Gamal, who I'm delighted to see, as I am delighted to see both Amy and Carl, who I've known for many, many years. It's wonderful to be back here, and I must say it's something of a relief that I am here at all after my experiences yesterday. But anyway, I really want this to be a more of a participatory event than a lecture. But I want to begin by saying some things about translation, about translating Arabic, and about translating Arabic fiction. I think the most important thing to realize about translation is that in spite of the fact that digital technology is becoming more and more able to convey certain aspects of meaning from one language into another, in my opinion, there will never be a time when we can rely entirely on mechanical translation. There are umpteen examples as to why this is the case. I could quote to you in Arabic, Yumtir Qitat wa Kilab, which is, I think, a reasonably accurate version of It's Raining Cats and Dogs. But on the other hand, I'm not quite sure if any Arab native speaker, if you use that to say that it's raining quite hard, is going to understand what you're saying and why you're saying it. It doesn't sound much better in French either. Il pleut des chiens des chats. So there are always going to be these nuances, but it gets quite serious when you're talking about negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. In the wake of the 1967 during the war, the so-called Naksa, the agreement talked about, in English, occupied territories, and the French talks about les territoires occupés. And of course, the Israelis have been very interested in adopting one particular version of it, the French version, rather than the more generalized English version. So translation is a very fallible medium, and it's one where I think the first thing I want to start by saying that in the realm of literary translation, which is what I have been primarily concerned with. I haven't translated any other types of texts which are not literary. Literary translation is a massive act of interpretation. And the role of the translator of literature, in spite of the policies of the large number of American universities and their tenure committees, is the most advanced exercise in literature scholarship and its application. And I wish to say that loud and clear, as I have said in writing any number of tenure support letters over my career to a variety of universities. I'm not sure they've all believed me or taken it seriously, but it is the case. In order to be a literary translator, you have to be a literature scholar. What does that mean exactly? Well, I think in the modern period, it would certainly imply that you have some knowledge of literary theory. Literary theory, of course, being a subject which is of no great vintage, at least in the American university context, but certainly requires discussion of such places where literature scholarship and linguistic scholarship combine and overlap, such as semantics and things like that. I'm currently involved also at the University of Pennsylvania and above all its Linguistics Data Consortium with the preparation of what may be the first ever historical dictionary of Arabic. Those of you who study Arabic may note that to our cost there is no historical dictionary of Arabic. There are some very large Arabic dictionaries, extremely large. Lisan al-Arab and Taj al-Arus. Neither of them give you any idea about when a word meant what. They give you all the combined meanings of that word, and my favorite, of course, comes from the Lisan al-Arab under the root waw, tha, ba. This, of course, is a famous narrative for those involved in Arabic lexicography, because it talks about a messenger from the Najd who was sent to convey greetings to the king of Hadramaut. Adil's already smiling, so I think he knows this. Well, it's in your Festschrift, of course. King of Hadramaut, and he arrives in Hadramaut in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, and they tell him that the king is hunting. People in the Arabian Peninsula seem to hunt quite a lot, whether in the Arabian Peninsula or Morocco or wherever it is. Anyway, so he's told to go to this particular wadi where he will find the king. So he goes to the wadi and rides up to the king, gets off his horse and salutes, and the king says the fatal word, Thib. Now, just to tell you what happens, the messenger says, Your Majesty, I am in your country, therefore I am bound to obey your command. He goes to the edge of the wadi and jumps off and is killed. The king says in Hadramauti dialect, which I can't do very well, but what the heck happened? And they said, well, unfortunately, Thib is the fi'l amr, it's the imperative of one of those awkward Arabic verbal structures, the fi'l mithal. It's a verb which begins with waw. And so for reasons best known to the development of Arabic, it drops the waw in the mudari'. But unfortunately, wathaba for us means to sit down. Parenthesis, comfortably. Up north, where they don't speak Arabic properly, and Arabs are still saying that wherever you are against every other Arab person speaking Arabic, up there in the north, in the Najd, it means to jump. Well, you can, of course, do a number of things now. For example, look at the root tha, ba, probably expressed through the root tha, ba, ba. And if you look it up, you'll find, guess what? It means to sit. So what exactly has happened? Well, we don't know. But all of which is to say that when it comes to translation, lexicography is already a problem. Because we do not, at this point, it has to be said, have an adequate lexicon of the Arabic language, equivalent, say, and you may be able to tell from my accent where I come from, equivalent of the Oxford English Dictionary, which gives you every single word and also tells you what its first instance was and what it's meant at different periods in the development of the English language, and most importantly, which still continue. In other words, the preparation of dictionaries of this type is a continuing process. Anyway, that's a bit of a side leap, but the point is that translation has to involve scholarship. Nobody can simply sit down and transfer one text from one language into another without knowledge of particularly certain features, firstly and clearly of language. When I talk about literature, I'm talking about culture. The process of translating Arabic literary texts has been, into English, I'm talking about primarily now, has been a somewhat checkered process. Some of the earliest translations of, for example, the Jahili poetry really failed to capture the nature of the imagery involved, but above all, the effect of orality and performance on the process of performing those texts and thus of producing the kinds of translations of those texts that will in some way try to convey to the reader of the translation what the original audience, and I use that word specifically, audience, not readership, audience really feels. And of course, many of you may be aware of the superb translation of the Quran by Michael Sells, which precisely does that. And he specifically has said that he's only translated the Quran from Surah 55 onwards, because those are the surahs in which the application of linguistic and literary principles to the process of conveying what the Quran, not only what it says, what it means, but what its impact is. Because the Quran, as you probably all know, is essentially an oral document. It's primarily oral. The textual side of it is subsequent to its oral nature. Its oral origins, the process of transferring it into writing, and the fact that, I forget who it is, it may be Bill Graham or somebody who has studied the Quran, that the Quran as a phenomenon is still, whether it's on television now or its recordings or whatever it is still primarily an oral phenomenon. But so translation is the act of carrying something across. Across, lation, carrying. Carrying what across? Well, obviously, we start by talking about something which we'll call meaning. But it's, of course, extremely rash to assume that meaning between languages is somehow similar or universal. It's not. What is the extent to which you wish to try to convey the linguistic aspects of a particular literary form in a translation? Primary example from the Arabic literary tradition, which I'll give you, in which I have foolishly engaged once in a while, the maqama. Now, the maqama is very famous as being what I will call a modern genre in the classical period of Arabic literature. It doesn't go back to the beginning. It is the result of developments in the post-Islamic period and in the conjunction of a variety of different cultural traditions within the general focus of the expanding Islamic dominions. So Humphrey Davis, my colleague translator, has just produced a spectacular parallel text translation of a work which is not actually from the classical period, but it's from the 19th century. And that is the horrendously difficult text of Ahmed Faris al-Shidyaq, As-Saq ala Saq. And he's done it in English rhyming prose, if you can believe it. Gert-Jan van Gelder has also produced some rhyming prose versions of maqamat, but not in, in his wonderful new collection of classical Arabic literature, which if you don't know it, you certainly should. All this just coincidentally, apropos of translation, and what I'm currently involved with is part of the incredibly interesting and important new project from New York University's Abu Dhabi campus, which is called the Library of Arabic Literature, which intends to produce editions of the great works from the classical period. I'll use that word classical, I don't like it very much, pre-modern period of Arabic Islamic culture. And you may have seen a number of them have come out, more are coming out. I am, for my pains, which must be many, I am currently doing a parallel text translation of what will be the most modern, what can I call it as an oxymoron, the most modern classical Arabic text, which is Al-Mulhiz. Well, those of you who know may know it as Hadith Isa ibn Hisham. However, that's not what this text is. This text is a parallel text version of the original newspaper articles that eventually became Hadith Isa ibn Hisham. The original in the newspaper was called Fatra min Zaman, a period of time. I've published an English translation of part of this before. I've also published the complete works in Cairo through the Majlis al-Thaqafa, but now I've gone back and I'm doing the whole thing all over again, because even though I happen to be of British origins, Al-Mulhi decided, probably because of the fact that this was being published during the British occupation of Egypt, Al-Mulhi left out anything which is nasty about the British. I have had a certain Schadenfreude experience in putting it all back in. The primary thing, of course, which gets left out, which radically transforms this text, is any reference to the war in the Sudan, which is a huge event in the late 1890s, as you may know. Not to mention Gordon of Khartoum and Lord Kitchener of all this, but the state of the Egyptian army and on and on. Anyway, so there's an example, you see, of a case where not only what you translate, I mean, I was asked to translate it again, and I said I would, but how you translate it. What is the nature of the source text? And here I'm using one term which comes out of translation theory, which I also teach some of my, or have taught some of my long-suffering graduate students. But since they include Dwight Reynolds, Devin Stewart, Shaukat Turawa, and others, I guess they survived. But the source text, what is the source text? And one thing which Philip Kennedy and his colleagues at NYU Abu Dhabi have done is to say, before we even talk about the English version, let's make sure we have a source text which is an example of the best possible editorial processes we can currently indulge in. My colleague at Penn and former student Joseph Lowry has done Shafi'i's Risala. Okay, Shafi'i's Risala. Shafi'i, right, one of the founders of the 4 schools of Islamic law. So his Risala should be in pretty good shape, right? No, the text was a mess. He had to go through and completely redo the Arabic text first before he started work on the translation. And this has been the case with every one of these examples for the Library of Arabic Literature. The Arabic text has to be put into the best possible form it can be, using all the manuscripts available. Professor Smith will remember us spending many happy hours upstairs in the Darul Kutub library in the early 1970s, going through newspapers. I went right through the Muwailahi newspaper. Of course, there was no Xeroxing in those days, so you wrote out everything longhand. I still have it in the basement of my house. Things have improved a lot, and fortunately, I now have a CD-ROM containing the complete text of the Muwailahi newspaper, which makes life a lot easier. So, talking about translation theory, the source text is what you start with. And what I hope in the discussion you may want to ask me, well, how do you choose? I'm not going to say how I choose now, but that's one of the things maybe we could talk about. Then the important phase is the intertext phase. That's when you sit down with what you hope is a sort of fixed source text. You've decided what you want to translate. You probably hope you've decided why you want to do this, why you want to undertake this incredibly slow and rigorous process. And then you start work. And I teach a course on translation theory and practice at the University of Pennsylvania, or rather I did, and get students to begin the process of translating initially shorter texts. And Robert Bly, a very famous American poet, has a rather distressing book called The 8 Stages of Translation. He's talking about translating poetry. And perhaps there we may be talking about different phases. In my own case, this intertext phase probably lasts, if I'm talking about something of novel length, of between 9 months and a year. I'd suggest to you, those of you who may be interested in translating, translation is not something you can do in a rush, or if you do, it's not going to be very good, and you'll have to go back and do large parts of it again. The first part obviously involves taking, in our case, an original Arabic text and producing an English version of it, which will probably include a number of variant possibilities for a variety of different aspects of language. Imagery. I've just talked about raining cats and dogs, and that's not going to work. So you're going to make decisions about what you're going to do about that. You probably won't make final decisions immediately, or rather I suggest it's not a good idea to make final decisions immediately. In my case, when I get to the end of the text, and of course how long that takes will depend on how long the original text is. I've just translated the autobiography of the Moroccan Minister of Religious Affairs, Ahmed Tawfiq. I previously translated 2 of his works. It's a 250-page work, and it took me about 8 months. Because I also find that you can translate for a while, then a law of diminishing returns happens very quickly. I then leave the text for probably a period of 2 to 3 months. The second stage of the intertext, for me at least, involves then taking the English version only and trying to produce an English text that you would want to show to your mother-in-law or whoever might be disarmingly frank in their appreciation of what it is you've done, what kind of English text this is. The third stage of the intertext phase, after another period, is the hardest. Because now you are at the closest stage to the third level of translation, and that is the target text. And the target text is going, you hope, to be published in the target culture. So you have now to turn your reasonably nice English text into something which is recognizably a version of the original that you are prepared to defend, not only because of what you hope is its accuracy, whatever that means in this context, but accuracy not only linguistically but culturally, that it can be culturally authentic. And here I'm reminded of a very famous statement by the German philosopher, translator Friedrich Schleiermacher. And this is frequently quoted in books about translation. And by the way, for those of you who may be interested, either because of this or whatever, in that, the one person who I always recommend to students and people interested, the one scholar is Lawrence Venuti, who has some extremely useful works in English about translation theory and practice. But it's at this stage that you have to decide what aspects of the original source culture you're going to introduce into the target culture. Schleiermacher says, my preference is to foreignize the reader, not to domesticate the text. In other words, I'll say to you, quite frankly, to me at least, the purpose of translation is not to introduce the reader to the familiar. There's no point in doing that. There's no point in trying to gloss over cultural differences in the context of translation. But here, of course, is where what I said earlier on comes home to roost. Translation is a maximal act of interpretation. You, as a translator, are working in the extremely complex transcultural environment in which this text finds itself. And then, of course, you take that text, and here's where life gets rough. The target culture. And above all, in presenting things to the target culture, we're talking mostly about publishers. Oh dear. Of all the cultures known to me, and I have worked on many European projects in Spain, Germany, France, and Italy, the Anglo-American publishing industry is by far and away the most miserable in terms of publishing, well, let's say works from Arabic literature into English. The commercial press is almost entirely uninterested. And there are some interesting stories about my late and wonderful colleague Edward Said being told that the problem is, of course, that Arabic is a controversial language. I wonder what makes a language controversial. But anyway, a language controversial, mind you. But anyway, so we are talking primarily here about a number of university presses, and particularly some notable presses which I will identify, Syracuse and Texas, who really have programs in place to convey to an American public translations of works, good works from the modern Arabic literary tradition. The pre-modern Arabic tradition is even harder, of course, and that's where the Library of Arabic Literature is performing a wonderful service, although one wishes, of course, that it could be much broader than that. One of the great ironies is another great source of translations of works of pre-modern Arabic literature into English is Germany, as is the case with scholarship on that particular period and that particular subject too. So the reception in the target culture is extremely problematic. Now, of course, I've been very fortunate because I am a correspondent of the Swedish Academy, and in 1987 nominated a certain Egyptian novelist for the Nobel Prize. It so happened that he won it. And so I have had the opportunity not only to work with him, to spend many hours with him while he was still alive, but also to translate many of his works into English. Not perhaps the most famous of all, the trilogy. The trilogy actually being an interesting example of some of the problems connected with translation of texts into English. The one I focus on, of course, is the titles. And I asked the question, I don't know, I haven't read any text lately where English novels discussing Paris talk about a street called the Elysian Fields. And I wonder why one doesn't talk about the Elysian Fields in English, but for some reason or other, one has to talk about Sugar Street in Cairo. Quite apart from the fact, of course, that Sugar Street conveys all sorts of subtexts which the Arabic original absolutely doesn't do. So it was wonderful to work with Mahfouz. It was also wonderful, interesting in quotes to work with Yusuf Idris, but for quite different reasons. Yusuf Idris was nothing if not lively, and I suppose most recently the most fulfilling process of trying to interest this target audience has been the fact that about 20 years ago I deliberately decided that I would focus on the literature of the Maghreb, and particularly the literature of Morocco. And I've now translated 9 Arabic novels by Moroccan authors into English, and I'm very happy that 2 of them have won big prizes. I can go rattling on and on about these things. I've tried to talk about the process of translation in a sort of detached way, but obviously I can, if you like, and I'd really like to hear from you, I can talk about specific aspects of translation or what I've translated or why I've translated something. So I think I'll stop here yakking and open it up to discussion for anybody who wants to talk.